Is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood the new Pulp Fiction? Hi there and welcome back to Circuit the World. My name's Alice and today we're discussing Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the latest film by Quentin Tarantino starring Leonardo DiCaprio, Brad Pitt and Margot Robbie. It's kind of an homage to the 60s, but the turn of the 60s where film started to rise up against television and film acting and stuff was much more important than TV acting. The film takes you through the life of Rick Dawson and him kind of struggling to find his place in the world, if you will, as westerns and TVs become a thing of the past and are not as required for as they used to be. It kind of shows the era change. It's also kind of replacing the old with the new, and then where did the old fit in kind of mentality throughout the whole film. Quentin Tarantino's films can be a bit hit and miss. I think The Hateful Eight was absolutely torn apart. I can't personally comment because I haven't seen that film, but from the reviews and things I've heard about it, it was no good at all. However, Django Unchained, which was I think that was the one Tarantino did before The Hateful Eight, that was a phenomenal film. I really, really love that one, and you know, it goes a bit off the rails in a very, very Tarantino-esque way towards the end, but I thoroughly enjoyed that film. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is one of the greatest films I think I've seen this year. I really enjoyed it. It was so, to me, it was so Tarantino pure. You could see his direction and his style all the way through it. And it was really, really strong, really good little film. Some of the standout scenes to me, like there's the whole scene where Rick has the conversation with himself in the caravan or in the trailer when he's on set because he forgot a line and he's annoyed at himself for forgetting the line, and basically you get a real insight into his almost internal battle that he's having with himself, in that he knows he's on the edge, he knows he's on a line where one tip the wrong way and he could completely be lost from use or from desire from all of these producers and the such, and he's trying to like remake himself and remake a name for himself in an era that maybe doesn't want him anymore. And the scene in the trailer where he shouts at himself and he gets angry at himself, and it's just such a beautiful insight into that, and it's so real and pure that you as the audience, you feel an empathy for him in that moment, because everybody's been there, everybody's had that moment, and it's just the raw realness of it. Also, the most beautifully shot scene in the entire film with the mirrors. I literally just sat, never let this scene stop. The placement of the mirrors where you can see him talking to himself, because visually he is talking to himself. Oh, it was just absolutely beautiful and really, really spot on. When I came out of seeing it for the first time, I got very strong Pulp Fiction vibes from it, which led me to think, will this be the new Pulp Fiction of this era? You have the kind of stories within stories where you have Rick's story about him trying to find his place in the world as the world moves on without him. You have Cliff's story where he's been a stuntman, is now kind of Rick's peon, if you will, and just is kind of around. It doesn't really have a predominant role in Rick's story, but has a role in his own story, which very much reminded me of the Samuel Jackson and John Travolta roles in Pulp Fiction, where they start together and then they kind of go off and do their own stories and then they kind of come back together at the end. Margot Robbie's character, Sharon Tate, was very similarly portrayed to Uma Thurman's character in Pulp Fiction, where she kind of dipped in and out the story. She was the leading lady, but she didn't have as much front and focus as you thought she would. I have to make a confession. I don't really enjoy Pulp Fiction. I'm sorry, to me, the focus was always on the wrong person. I wanted so much more of the Tarantino. I wanted so much more of Samuel Jackson and John Travolta's pairship. And so when you kind of dip into them at the start and then you dip back into them at the end, they're my most favourite parts of the film. To me, the rest of it's kind of just a bit off-piste. And I think the thing I found with it was because you've got so many different characters and so many places you're trying to focus at once, you don't know where exactly you're supposed to be focusing. Which is one of the things I didn't like. It's almost like I didn't know where I was supposed to be looking all the time. But in response to that, this film almost took what went right in Pulp Fiction and did it again by doing it in its own different way with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It had the main focus on Rick's story and Cliff's story, and it kind of stuck with them. Although you do have the entire scene with Cliff where he goes off to the old film set and he meets up with the hippies and it all kind of goes a bit off-piste again. And once again, that was just another part where it got to the end of that, I was like, right, that made no ends to the story. That made no difference to the story. So what exactly, why did I just waste half an hour watching you do that? But predominantly it stuck with Rick and Cliff, and there was a very solid baseline story throughout the whole thing, but every now and then we jump off and on even to other stories. A bit like the bit with Margot Robbie's character Sharon Tate, which confused me a lot. Obviously, Margot Robbie's character is the only character based off a real life person, someone who lived, and Sharon Tate has a very well-known specific story. For those of you who don't know, she was in the prime of her acting career and she was killed. It was never really discovered who killed her. She was killed in her home. There was a lot of suspects. I think it was in a park. I can't remember. When I went into this film, thought that was going to be baseline of the story, like an underlying story of the actual story we're watching. But the scene with her when she goes to the cinema, the first time I saw the film, I was very, very confused because Margot was acting as if it was her she was watching, but obviously it was very clear it wasn't her that she was watching. The way I read it, Tarantino decided he wanted to use real footage of Sharon Tate to kind of show that it was a real person, but obviously makeup's all good and well, but there's only so much you can make someone look like somebody else without going whole hog. So I think the idea was to emulate that Margot was Sharon Tate and that she was going through all the things that Sharon Tate went through, but to as a close resemblances. Tarantino films are very well known for going extremely off-piste, and you know, you think you're watching a happy little film and then suddenly everybody's face gets blown off. From the end of a Tarantino film, you just don't know what's going to happen. Now, knowing what I did about Sharon Tate's real life story, when it came towards the end where Rick and Cliff come back from Italy and they go out, and then you're kind of getting timestamps and this is what so-and-so is doing at this time, this is what so-and-so is doing at this time, this is blah, 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 blah. And you're getting blow by blow of an evening, which you don't have throughout any of the rest of the film, sorry. It's just in that moment that you have that. I thought that it was going to go to, this is our assumption of what happened that evening with Sharon, or in our universe, this is how Sharon got killed. But instead what it does is completely flips itself on the head, and it turns the attack on Rick and Cliff, which is the most disgusting but a very good scene in the film as well. It really does go 0 to 100 in that moment. It's interesting because my assumption when I went into the film was you were going to see this film that was based in the 60s, kind of portraying what it was like to be in the film industry in the 60s, but then kind of also with this underlying dark tone of, you know, mobs and unrest and what it was like to be in America in the 60s as well. Which you do get that parallel because you have the whole hippie scenes and you have the rich and fabulous scenes with the actors and things. So you do kind of see that, but it is at the end where it's almost like, that is what you thought you were going to see, but that's not what you're going to see. I find there's quite a few moments in it that did remind me of Pulp Fiction, and it did have very Pulp Fiction vibes and follows two male lead characters. You have stories within stories going on all the time, though in my opinion, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood does it better because it focuses more on one story rather than lots of stories. Red Apple cigarettes also appear in both films, which I don't know if that means anything, but there's that. In opposition to Pulp Fiction starts with a scene that's very gangs and violence and blood and gore and everything in your face, and it ends very kind of subdued and almost melancholy and reflective, if you will. Whereas Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is the exact opposite, in which it starts softer and more reflective and thinking about the good old times and trying to rekindle what you once had, and ends with the scene that's can definitely turn one's stomach. Also, speaking back about the mirrors seem to be something that Tarantino uses a lot to give a moment of reflection in the character where you're seeing the character but they're seeing something different in themselves. I think they're just wonderful moments. I love them, and I think, especially because it's such a bitch to film with a mirror, because you have to worry about catching the reflection of the camera in the mirror. I really, really like mirror shots. I think they're great, and I think they can do so much storytelling. You don't really need to be any movement or any lines, any dialogue. You can just show so much with having two versions of the same character on screen. Another thing that's similar about Pulp Fiction and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is that the endings are fairly similar in the sense that you're in a very tense situation where you don't really know what's going to happen. So for Pulp Fiction, it's the diner scene where the couple is trying to do the bank robbery on the diner, and it ends up with Samuel Jackson's character getting a gun to the face, but you just don't know because it's a Tarantino film. It could very easily get out, walk away, and get blown to pieces because why not? Also, because of the way the storyline is done in Pulp Fiction, which is very non-linear, very kind of all over the place, you only see Samuel Jackson's character in scenes that, in a linear perspective of that film, are at the beginning of the story rather than towards the end. So you don't know if he's going to survive this because you don't really see him anymore in the film. It's a very similar situation at the end of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, in which you have the hippie run on the house where they try and attack them, whereas Pulp Fiction does it in a much more subdued and subtle way in juxtaposition to the beginning of the film. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood literally runs at it with violence. And there is that really nice juxtaposition to the start, especially with the final shot of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is a very similar kind of establishing pan shot to what you have at the very start of the film. So it's almost like full circle. It's interesting to see the juxtaposition between the beginning and the start of the films that are fairly similar in play out, but end very similarly, but end so differently. So if you have seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, let me know in the comments down below what you thought of it, and also let me know if you think it can be put on par in the same place as Pulp Fiction, as one of Tarantino's greatest films. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today and discussing Once Upon a Time in Hollywood with me. It's been an absolute blast as always. If you enjoyed this video, go show that like button some good old-fashioned love. And if you want to support the channel, why not hit that subscribe button? Stay awesome, and I'll see you all in the next video! I literally cannot get over that mirror scene.